Well, thank you very much, Julia. I'm really, really excited to be here. You know, Airmic is such an important organization in terms of helping our senior executives, helping professionals in the business understand risk and manage it better. It is a delight to be here, and I know you've had a fantastic conference, so I'm hoping I can add to that. So I'm going to talk about risk in the boardroom. And risk in the boardroom is incredibly important because when you get it wrong, it can wreck everything. But risk in the boardroom really isn't about risk because what boards are in the business of doing is making sure that companies are successful. And so that's what we're going to talk about today. So what companies need to do and what boards are charged with doing is they are unitary boards. So together, they're responsible for driving the success of the company. They set the strategy and they ensure that the management is taking actions to make sure that the company is successful. So far, so good. How does risk play into that? Well, risk is really important because ultimately, there is no reward. There is no success unless you take risk. And so the board is ultimately responsible for deciding how much risk the company takes. And some people call that the risk appetite, but ultimately it is how you put together your strategy. Are you going to have a strategy that requires you to take a lot of risk? And then how are you going to go about doing that? Are you going to do it in a risky way or are you going to do it in a safe way? And there are trade-offs for all of those. And the board is responsible for making sure that management is making the right trade-offs. And as we know, since 2008, that's getting very difficult because regulators are requiring that boards manage risk more effectively, and they're personally responsible. And the SMCR, for those of you in financial services, you'll know this, is really driving that. They're saying you're personally accountable for ensuring that you have a good control environment and that you take steps if you see things that aren't right. Now, this, from a board's perspective, is really nerve-wracking because they need to make sure that they are taking all of these steps and that they can prove it if somebody acts there. And if you're not in a regulated industry, the buck doesn't stop just there because things are changing. The FRC, which is our corporate governance regulator here in the UK, has made very clear that they are considering putting in place a SOX regime, so like a Sarbanes-Oxley in the US, where you're going to have to attest that you have managed your risks effectively. So companies, whether you're in regulated or financial services or not, you're going to be having to look at this risk conundrum carefully. Now, sorry, I've just got to get my clicker to work here. Sorry, I'm reconnecting. There we go. Now, for boards, when you're trying to figure out the amount of risk that you want to take, this can be very daunting. The reality is, because of this risk-reward trade-off, and because there is literally no reward without risk, you've got to figure out how much risk you want to take to do your strategy. So the reality is that the highest rewards tend to be in the high risk area. So if you look at this diagram, which I love using, right? Risk on one side, reward on the other side. Top right, that is where the most money is, right? This is Netflix territory. This is Amazon Prime. This is where you're out on a limb and you're going to try to get market share. You're trying to gain a march on your competitors, but you might have to take some risk. You might not be making money, for instance, while you're doing that. But you need to take that risk in order to grow. As you become a more mature company, generally, you start to understand your risks better. And so your risk goes down. And for a time, you can make sure that you can keep getting returns. So you're in lower risk, but high reward. That is a fantastic way to be, by the way. And a lot of the insurance industry, for instance, is in that. Well understood risks, but they can still make a good margin, right? Lower risk, high reward. Then you can move on as you move into even more mature industries. And what happens often is that you have low risk but low reward. And that's where businesses are really stultifying. That was like the blockbuster years, right? When you know what you're doing, but you're actually getting margin erosion all of the time. And then there's the one that the boards are really terrified, which is, and I think you guys talked about it today, right? The gray rhino scenario, or frankly, what I call the own goal scenario, which is where you're in high risk, low reward territory. And this can happen all of the time. And boards are terrified of this, right? Risks that you don't know. What you don't know will kill you. And so boards are always trying to figure out, where are we in this cycle? And you don't want to have too many things in your company be in the far right. And you definitely don't want to be in the far right without knowing that you're in the far right. But you do have to go there. And that's why risk management for boards is really important, and why all of you as professionals are really important, because the companies that can understand their risks the best can be on that right side of that curve and right side of that diagram very comfortably. They can make more money, right? And a good example of that is Netflix, because they are out there. They gained market share. They went and they built content when they didn't have customers, and as a result, they were able to sort of steal a march on their competitors. Disney, as a good example, will have moved from the bottom left, right? 10 years ago, Disney was a bunch of princesses, and they were basically milking it, but they weren't really any new good content. Then they merged with Pixar, right? They bought Pixar. They got Marvel. They moved into that sort of right territory. They took some risks. They bought some companies. They paid a lot of money, but it paid off for them. So that's what companies are trying to do. And that's why risk management is important, because the more that you know about your risks, the more money you can make safely. So, next page. Now, one of the problems for boards, and again, I think you will have talked about this today with the gray rhinos, is that people are very biased. And in fact, companies on the whole are not very good at risk management. And you'll know that if you're a risk management professional, right? You always feel like you can only get it wrong. When I go to the board, that's what I always feel like. I can only get this wrong because they expect it's going to be perfect, but it isn't. And why isn't it perfect? Well, it's not perfect for a lot of reasons, but one of the reasons that boards really focus on is bias. And that's because management tends to be biased. You'll become a CEO in a really big company because you really believe you can do it. And because you believe you can do it, you almost inevitably have an optimism bias. Your CEO will think that they can do anything, or your CEO will present to you information or only look at information that confirms what they already know, because they've got a theory of the world. They think they're going to make this happen. They go out and they find the data to support it. Well, inevitably, that means when they're presenting that data, they leave out data that doesn't follow with what they want to do. Control is another one, right? And a lot of companies fall into this, where they think that they have control of their risks because everything's green. And KPMG, by the way, was very good at this. We enjoy a nice chart, with a lot of green on it, and we really don't like red. And so people like to feel like they're in control. But the problem is that when you're in control, or you feel like you're in control, sometimes that means that you're willing to take on more risks. And again, as a board, your job is to try to figure out which of these biases are in there in your management. Because on the one hand, you want to keep encouraging them to do the right thing, to take the right risks so that you can make money, so that the company can be successful, but not take so many that you tip over sort of into the wrong territory. So what is fundamentally a board, and how do boards work? So boards, and you'll all know this, right? They're on the outside. Their job is to look at management, to challenge what management is doing, to encourage management to do the right things, and basically to bring an outside perspective into what's going on. So they have certain advantages, right? The average board member has a wealth of experience. They tend to be in their 50s and their 60s. They are good at providing outside challenge because that's what they're there to do. And they generally are really well networked. So they know what's happening in other companies in a way that executives who are really kind of in the day-to-day of the business often don't have time or energy to be able to do. But I really would say to you, as somebody who has sat on outside boards and who now works with my board all the time, there's a lot of challenges with that. Boards are disconnected from the business. And this can be really difficult, right? They may not have experience in the industry. They may not understand the day-to-day flows of the business, and as a result, there's a real risk that they don't know what's going on. And I'm going to raise Wirecard here, right? Management can have, in certain circumstances, an information lock on what's going on with the board, and you'll see this, right? The board will ask a question to management, and management will say, "Oh no, you really don't have to worry about that because of this," or "Oh, that doesn't really matter because of that." And it's very difficult for a board acting in a bit of a vacuum to be able to follow up with management. And when management is not telling the truth, so for instance, let's say there's a missing 1.3 billion, it can be very difficult for a board to follow up on that. They're counting on the fact that outside auditors will find the fraud, or they're counting on the fact that something will happen. And it's difficult because the regulators are saying to boards, right, it's your job to connect the dots. And when you see things that are out of line, to follow up on them. But it's difficult because, again, management has the information and they may give you what seem like really reasonable answers to single questions. But, for boards, you have to keep stepping back, looking at it and saying, does that all hang together? Does that all hang together? And that's a really difficult thing to do. A third point for boards, and this is the one that when you get back to my other chart is really important, is that the control environment is difficult to assess. And it's also very difficult to get right. What companies tend to do is they have a problem and they tighten up. And you'll see this, by the way, in all the insurance graphs that happen with companies. They'll have or an industry, right? An industry will have a lot of problems, right? So for professional services, had a lot of problems over the last couple of years. You'll see a tightening up of controls. Then the controls will get too tight. and they have to loosen them in order to make more money, right? So that's what happens sort of across different industries and across different places. So boards are always feeling like, oh, is that control environment tight enough? I'm really worried it's not tight enough. Is the control environment so tight that we're strangling the business? Is it tight enough in the right places, or am I missing things? Or do I need to tighten it up in other places? And it's very hard for them to see that. Another one is that they tend to get tons of reports, voluminous reports, hundreds of pages of reports, tons and tons of information. Really, really hard to assess what's important and what's not. They have a sea of information, followed up by anecdotes from management who say, oh, you don't really need to look at that, or this one page is the really important one. And finally, most of the data that boards get, and you'll know this as risk management professionals, is static. It's often backward looking, and significantly it's not correlated. And by the way, I would call this out to you as a challenge, particularly the insurance industry, which is data rich. Companies don't know where they sit on a risk spectrum, and board members really have a difficult time, apart from asking somebody else, where they are on that risk spectrum. It's really, really hard to tell. Your risks are really perfectly uncorrelated, absent the ability to get more data around that. And I think that's a real gap that could be filled. So that's your issue. So you're, as a board member, you're constantly trying to sort of navigate between all of those things in order to drive enough risk into your company to achieve success, but not so much risk that you topple over. And finally, not scoring an own goal, right? By taking so much risk that you don't know about that it kills your company. So what should you do? Both as management, as a board, how do you work together? To me, the most important thing is to have a really clear strategy. If you know where you want to play, then you can figure out what the risks are. But what happens a lot of times is that the strategy is not that clear, and I think as risk management professionals, one of the things we have to do is constantly ask, really, what is our strategy? What clients are we going after? What investments do we need to make? Over what time scale do we need to make those investments? Because asking those kind of questions will drive out where the soft spots are, right? When are those clients going to come in? Who are those clients? What do we need to look for to see whether or not we're meeting our financial goals? Are we going to do this with a large untested computer platform that's never worked before? Do we need to do upgrades all on the same day, right? You can start fleshing out what are the issues that are falling under that. The other thing that boards need to do is be active on the megatrends. I think one of the things that I see that's very difficult for risk in the boardroom is that people tend to focus on the here and now. But the here and now, generally management has a good grip on. And if they don't, by the way, you should, the board members should get really on top of them. But the reality is management has a good grip on the here and now. But what kills you is the megatrends. You need to know what's coming down and what are the big forces that you have very limited control over that are going to impact your business. So, that's economic changes, regulatory changes, technological changes, demographic changes, environmental changes. I'll give you a good example of that for KPMG right now, right? Economic changes happening right now. We are having to put huge amounts of investment into our audit business and into other businesses in order to respond to changes in the economy. At the same time, our clients are under pressure and don't have as much money currently in the COVID situation, right, to pay. So there's real economic tension. Then there's regulatory changes, right? Audit is changing. Audit's a big part of our business, and we're going to have to change audits in order to do things like environmental audits that are going to make a big difference, but we're going to have to be able to invest in those. Technological changes, everything is moving to a platform, everything needs to be backed by data and analysis and AI, and again, you have to invest in that. Demographic changes, our workforce is getting younger, we have to learn how to train them, even though they're coming in maybe in a COVID environment where we're not there. And environmental change, again, everything is about ESG. We've got to be able to demonstrate to regulators and to wider stakeholders that audited companies, are doing the right thing and that they're not being greenwashed. So, all of these are things that the board needs to take into account to make sure the strategy is fit for purpose and is going to be successful in the future. And then you, as risk professionals, need to say, what are those mega trends for the board? What does that mean to our risk profile? Do we really understand the environmental impact of what we're doing when we get on planes, for instance? That's the area that boards should be focusing on. MI. I talk about simplifying MI, and I can't say this enough, both as a board member and as somebody who generates MI. You can drown people in MI, and they really, it will just create issues because people will have conversations about multiple things that just don't matter to the strategy. Find the MI that really matches your strategy. What are the key things you need to follow? And look at that. Try to find dynamic information, and I'll talk about this a little bit as we move on. There's so much information now out there, so much data, so much ability with the Internet of Things to be able to pull in information in different ways that you need to do that. And focus most importantly on actions. Again, if you look back at some of the Wirecard reports, and I'm just talking about the ones that are public. In fact, we've got an analysis on our website of public data. When people and board members ask questions, the most important thing is whether or not actions are happening. Are things being corrected? Are they being fixed? And last but not least, boards and people who work for boards need to be constantly scanning for issues and for disruption, because disruption's happening in every industry. People are coming in with cool platforms, interesting looks at data, particularly areas that there's a big dissonance between regulated and unregulated industries. People can come in an unregulated way and take your clients from you. So the board, it's really their job to be looking at that. Sorry, my clicker keeps losing its connection, so give me a second and I'm sure I'll whack up 2 slides. So a good example I actually thought was space, of the risk-reward trade-offs and what boards could do to make a difference. So NASA in the early 80s lost a bunch of ships trying to send people into space. As a result, they lost a lot of credibility. They became a very creaky organization with a lot of governance because obviously they were really afraid of losing people. And over time, there was less investment in NASA, and so it became a really difficult thing for them to get moving. Along comes SpaceX, Elon Musk, not a man that you would really think would necessarily be someone that NASA would partner up with. And so how did that happen? Really interesting, right? SpaceX, I think, was a company that became and got to be very good at taking risk. They started with a very small ship in 2003, very small, very tiny, very cheap. Because they knew that they could get it up into space. Over time, they eventually came up with a rocket that was able to take a satellite payload, and that's very, very lucrative to be able to do it. But that was not without problems, right? So if you look, in 2013, they had big problems with one of the thrusters on the rocket. In 2015, they had a software failure, and the parachute on the rocket didn't open, and they lost one of the rockets. Luckily, with which was a problem. In 2016, they had a launch pad explosion where they lost both the rocket and the satellite. And in 2019, one of their rockets actually fell over when it was sitting on the pad because of high winds. But every single time that happened, they doubled down, they learned their lessons, they changed things, they accepted the risk, they mitigated as many risks as they could, and they still kept moving. And as a result, they've actually worked with NASA to put a man into space. And what does that mean for NASA? Well, NASA probably had to get really comfortable with their risk management. I'm sure NASA had to take more risk than they did in their very, very structured approach. But they have safely sent people up into orbit, and significantly at a much, much reduced cost. NASA, when they started out, the Apollo mission was paying $390 million a seat to send astronauts into space. When they got the space shuttle up, it was $170 million. With SpaceX, 55 million a seat. So, with risk comes reward. And all within, my understanding is that the NASA tolerance of 3.5% loss. They have a 3.5% tolerance of loss. So that's how they were able to do it. And I think that's showing how good risk management and risk management, when it's applied intelligently, recognizing how much risk you need to take to be successful, can really change the dynamics of an industry and, frankly, put a man back on the moon, we hope. Or Mars. I think that's where they're actually trying to go now, is Mars. Sorry, still trying to click. There we go. So how can we support risk management in the boardroom? And I think this is really a kind of a call out for all of you. First of all, have a clear strategy. So you need to talk to your executives. If you're a risk management person, it can be really difficult, right, to get in the room when these conversations are happening, but you need to do it. You need to be there either when it's happening, or you need to get yourself aligned with the people who are actually setting the strategy, whether it be for your division, whether it be for the company as a whole, to really get an understanding of it. And risk can really help, right? Because when you ask the right questions, it makes the strategy crisp. It shows where the strategy might not work. It gets over that optimism bias. Because one of the problems you have when you're setting strategy, and I'm sure that in the Gray Rhinos talk, you talked about this, right? 5-year strategies, I think it's more likely that a monkey is going to hit a dartboard or something with a dart than that they're going to be successful. No plan survives contact with the enemy, generally. And you can sniff out the biases, you can sniff out the weak spots, and often that doesn't mean that you stop doing it. What it means is that you can get in early, and all risk professionals know this, right? The earlier you look at a problem, the better it's going to be, because you're going to be able to solve it early before it gets big. The second one is to understand the risks of the strategy and getting it wrong. One of the big things with companies is often, and boards really need to help companies with this. It's one of their sort of big things they do, is companies like to kind of let things roll a bit. They really, there's a big status quo bias in companies, right? Because everybody's kind of doing the same thing that they've always done. And one of the things, again, good risk management you can do is you can sort of point that out. You can say the risks of doing nothing are this. So you can force decisions by having good risk management. The third one, and I can't say enough about this one, is MI. To me, this is the biggest thing that risk management professionals can do. Lots of people like to take decisions based on their own personal experience, but everyone's personal experience is limited. And no one, for instance, has lived through what we're going through now with COVID, right? So the more data that you've got and the more that you can drive data decisions, data-led decisions, the more important you can be. For us at KPMG, this is really important. We have 600 partners who are all professionals. They all have a view on every single thing that we do, but their view, while very educated and very informed about certain things, is completely uninformed about other things. And so one of the ways that we drive good decision-making is to force data into the decisions, right? You need to look at the data, and you're not allowed to make a decision until you have the data. But by the way, once you have the data, you do have to make a decision, right? Because we're not going to allow that sort of status quo bias to kind of creep in, particularly in difficult situations. You need to demonstrate action. To me, that is the most important thing. That, if you're management and you're trying to get a board on side and make them realize that you're doing the right thing, take action. Show them that you're taking action. So when they ask a question, respond to it. When there's a risk and something happens, and this would be the SpaceX example, right? You go back and you learn, right? When your parachute doesn't open, and by the way, that was because of a software failure, they went back. They fixed that software. They demonstrated it was never going to happen again. That was how NASA got comfortable enough to consider using that rocket, right? To put people up into orbit. And finally, I would say be creative. We are at an amazing time in the insurance world, in the world of data and risk, where we actually can get our hands on much more data than we've ever had. So, get involved, use Airmic, use forums like this, get trend data, figure out where you are, try to correlate your risks, look at creative risk transfer. Particularly in this market, there's more of an opportunity, I think, than ever before. Even though we're in a hard market for insurance, the reality is that there's more of an opportunity to transfer risk. And if you're in that top right quadrant, right, you want to do anything that you can to safely bring down that risk, even if it means that your returns are going to be a little bit lower. So think creatively. You can add real value to your organization by thinking that. and use data, right, to counter those biases. You can be the important voice in the room. Risk management, particularly for boards, has two big advantages. One is you see the whole company, one way or another. Whether it's you're seeing it from the insurance, whether you're placing the insurance program or monitoring the claims, whether it is that you're the CRO and you're looking at trends across the organization, you can tie things together in a way that other professionals really never can. But the other thing that you can do is that you can point out the biases that other people have. You can say, are we really sure about that? Does the data, does the experience of this, support your very positive view of things? And I think that's a real value that you can add and that you can provide to that. And the thing I would say on a personal note, kind of finishing this up, is that be brave. You know more about this than anybody does. What often a lot of executives have is confidence. Board members are very polished and have a lot of knowledge, but they don't know as much about this stuff as you do. And they are afraid, right? For boards, it's really hard to get that risk-reward trade-off right. And if you're just the person who comes in with the spreadsheet doing the same thing every day, they will be appreciative. But what they will really, really appreciate is if you have a really good conversation around the strategy and some of the gaps that you can see because of knowledge that you've got that no one else has. And so I'm going to finish up now, assuming I can get to my final quote here with my clicker. There we go. And this is something that I live by. I really do believe in being brave. I have run businesses in my time, and in fact at KPMG, I'm just flipping jobs now to go and run the business. I've been the CRO. I think it's the same. I really do. If you understand your business, if you understand where you want to go, if you understand the data, and if you understand the decisions that you need to make, and you're brave, it's the same thing because we are all in it together. And as Venus would say, right, it's okay to be afraid, but it is not afraid. It's not good to let it ruin your decision-making process. There's always a reason to be afraid, but should you let it take over? Hell no. So good luck, everybody. Risk in the boardroom is super important, and you can all make a really big difference. So thank you very much.